Now just imagine for a moment the night, Hornet, sitting in a quiet cafe somewhere in the City of Tears, drinking whatever bugs drink, and listening to some quiet, soothing jazz. That's kind of what we're doing today, but not exactly. Hey everybody, my name is insaneintherainmusic, and I had an idea. I love video games, and I also love jazz music, so why not just put those two things together? And I'm not just talking about making covers of video game music. I'm thinking about, what if I rewrote the soundtrack to a video game using jazz? Now, if this sounds a little confusing to you, we'll explain it later in the video. But for now, let's talk about the game I've chosen to do this with, which is Hollow Knight. If you're not familiar with the game, Hollow Knight is a Metroidvania indie game developed by Team Cherry and released in 2017. It's an exceptionally well-crafted game set in the cryptic kingdom of Hallownest, a vast network of caverns which many creatures call home. It's got a deep story that's fed to the player pretty much just crumbs at a time, and the player is responsible for piecing together these separate threads into a rich tapestry of lore, and believe me, this game has a lot of that. Along with the characters, challenging combat, stunning visuals, and enigmatic plot, the game's score also does some major heavy lifting. Hollow Knight's score is originally composed by Christopher Larkin, and draws from a primarily orchestral palette. The score features many mysterious and contemplative small ensemble pieces featuring piano and string instruments, which serve to augment the ambiguity of the game's story. For high-energy moments, the soundtrack intensifies with more aggressive orchestral sounds and rhythms. Many of the ambient area themes include elements of dynamic music, which is music that responds to the player's current situation in the game. For example, when the player enters and exits combat, the music seamlessly changes to fit the new situation. Overall, the soundtrack is an extremely defining part of the game for many players, myself included, and is truly a gem not just among indie games, but games in general. Now I hope you see how much I love this game and this game's soundtrack. I could keep gushing about it for a while longer, but we don't have time for that today. The question you're probably asking now is, okay Carlos, I get it, you like the game, but what's with the jazz? I mean, why would you rewrite a soundtrack that you clearly love already? I'm glad you asked. In the paraphrased words of Mr. Satoru Iwata, on my business card, I am a YouTuber. In my mind, I am a gamer. But in my heart, I am a jazz musician. Jazz is such a wide genre that can encapsulate so many different moods, from soft and smooth ballads to music that's much more energetic and primal sounding. As far as I'm aware though, jazz isn't really perceived like this by most people. When most people think of jazz, they might think of 40s big band music, Miles Davis cool jazz, the playlist at your local Starbucks, or maybe some Kenny G smooth jazz. While all of these are paragons of different parts of the genre, there are also some styles of jazz that just don't get enough attention. You might not think that 40s big band music would be a good choice of underscore for Hollow Knight, and you'd probably be right, although I think that would be pretty funny. So I'd like to show you just how well jazz can function in a game score, and maybe you'll think a little bit differently of the genre. So now I'm thinking, man, Hollow Knight would sound so cool if it had some jazz in it, but also thinking, man, Christopher Larkin's score is so good, how could I ever step on the toes of the original music? And to that I say, you're absolutely right, so we're doing something completely different. Introducing the Video Game Rescoring Challenge! Here's how this is gonna work. I'm gonna pick a few locations from this game and write completely new music for those locations to serve as underscore, while also adhering to several rules. Rule number 1, no direct referencing of existing melodies or themes. In the interest of not stepping on the toes of the original music, and to keep this challenge interesting, I can't use any existing melodies from the original score. Rule number 2, no writing in the same key as the original piece. This one is pretty cut and dry. To help avoid using similar melodies, I can't write new music that is primarily in the same key as the original underscore. Brief instances of the same key are acceptable. Rule number 3, no using the same groove as the original piece. Similar to the previous rule, I won't be writing new music using the same groove as the original underscore. I chose to say groove instead of time signature since it's certainly possible to have two pieces be in the same time signature but have a completely different groove and feel. Rule number 4, no using the same instrumentation as the original piece. This one should be pretty easy since we're writing in a different genre for most of this, but in the interest of keeping things cut and dry, I made it a rule. And finally, rule number 5, the compositions must account for all possible states of the player. This has to deal with dynamic music. For instance, if the music is being used in an area where the player can explore and battle enemies, the music should be able to accommodate this change in mood. With these rules in hand, it's finally time to start the challenge. I picked the 4 locations I'm going to be working with, which are Greenpath, The Forgotten Crossroads, Hornet's Battle in Greenpath, and the City of Tears. I was pretty nervous for how this was going to go, especially considering I'm such a big fan of the game and the score, but I thought this would be a fun challenge, and at the very least, it would be good practice, so let's jump into it. Now that the whole blank canvas is right there in front of me, the intimidation factor began to set in, and I'm sure any creative person who's been given a task without any strict parameters or restrictions can absolutely relate to this feeling. How am I supposed to come up with 4 compositions for this game? I needed to do a spotting session, which is something where a composer sits down and identifies what type of music and how the music is going to function whenever they're scoring something like a TV show, film, or video game. Since this project wasn't exactly the same as scoring something from scratch, I already had a video game to work with, I decided to use that to my advantage, and I played through the game on mute. Yeah, as much as it pained me to turn the music slider in the game's menu down to 0, it was a necessary first step in answering the question of, what if Hollow Knight's soundtrack was jazz? And let me tell you, it was weird. It was so strange to enter the town of Dirtmouth with no wistful cello or piano to greet me, and boss battles immediately lost a bit of their differentiation from the rest of the gameplay without the music to back it up. The sound effects were still there, so I could still hear things like ambient noises, combat sounds, and voices of characters, but the experience was certainly missing a big piece. Experiencing a piece of media with one of the core elements missing is absolutely one of the best ways to understand just how important that element is. And by going through this process, I gained even more appreciation for Hollow Knight's score. To narrow down my musical stylistic options, I decided to engage in one of the most quintessential activities of road trippers of my generation, making a Spotify playlist. I played through the game, and at the same time, began to build a playlist of music on Spotify that I thought would serve as inspiration or a guide for my musical choices. I won't be playing any of the music in that playlist in this video due to copyright restrictions, but if you'd like to listen to the music, the playlist is available in the description. My search for a style of jazz that would fit Hollow Knight began with Brian Blade and the Fellowship Band. I was introduced to this band in high school, and they were my gateway into a kind of modern jazz that's really earthy, spiritual, and raw. Brian Blade is absolutely one of my favorite jazz drummers. His sensitivity, time feel, and dynamic range are just so awesome, and it's so refreshing, especially in today's world of loud, louder, and loudest. The Fellowship Band itself has a traditional jazz trio in it, with piano, upright bass, and drums, also filled out with things like jazz guitar and woodwinds. While they do have some faster stuff, most of their music that I like tends to be very ballad-like, with the guitars or the woodwinds playing really softly with the melodies, almost sounding like a singer whispering into a microphone. Hollow Knight's atmosphere is so subtle and delicate, and this music does a great job of conveying that atmosphere while not being so forward and driving to break the delicate surface tension created by the game's atmosphere. Another piece of music that immediately came to mind was Lars Danielson's record Libretto. I was introduced to this through the r/jazz subreddit quite a few years ago, and it's an interesting blend between the worlds of jazz, classical music, and European folk music. The elements of European folk melodies in particular are really cool here. They remind me of long-lost stories that were passed down through oral traditions, which kind of reminds me of Hollow Knight's really cryptic lore that the player has to piece together. There are plenty of other awesome artists in this vein, including Chick Corea, Go-Go Penguin, Antonio Sanchez, and Aaron Parks. They're all in this playlist. You're welcome to check out this playlist on Spotify, link is in the description, and I also threw in the music that I composed for this challenge in the playlist itself. So it's finally time to get started writing the music for this rescore. With this playlist in hand, I decided to start with Greenpath. Even though Greenpath isn't the chronological first of the locations I mentioned, it's a good first tune to write for reasons that we'll get into later. In the words of the Wanderer's Journal, Greenpath is an exuberant green cavern, composed of diverse vegetation, mossy valleys, and broad lakes of acid. These features are deeply reflected in its inhabitants, who developed a natural mossy camouflage, allowing them to perfectly blend in with their surroundings. This location is one of my personal favorites in all of Hallownest. I grew up around a lot of nature and moss here in the Pacific Northwest, and I think that's part of why I feel so connected to this area. The score for Greenpath captures the area so wonderfully. It's a 3/4 piece based primarily in E minor with a constant harp ostinato that goes throughout the whole piece to keep it moving forward. The instrumentation feels really organic, featuring instruments like marimba, clarinet, bassoon, and kalimba, which suit this atmosphere super well. I think this track manages to stand out from the other tracks in Hollow Knight by adding in a bit more playfulness into the mix. Unlike some of the other tracks in the OST, Greenpath has a bit more bounce and inquisitiveness, which is something I really wanted to capture in my composition and in my approach to the soundtrack overall. To capture the playfulness I was going for, I based my new piece titled In Bloom around a 12/8 African bell pattern. This groove is energetic, but it isn't so rhythmically tricky as to overshadow the gameplay. I orchestrated the bell pattern by giving it to a palm-muted acoustic guitar to capture some of the earthiness I was looking for, and also incorporated it into a drum set part played with brushes to keep things sounding subtle. The melody in this piece, played primarily by saxophone and jazz guitar, floats above the ambiguous harmonies beneath it. Maybe the ambiguous harmony is like the acid and the melody is like the bubbles that rise to the top at the bottom of Greenpath. That's a nice vision. To balance out the playfulness of this pattern with some mystery, I used patterns of major 7th and minor 7th chords in the piano moving in parallel motion, to give the overall effect of a composition that doesn't sound dissonant or anything, but also isn't obviously rooted in one spot, which kind of fits the nomadic, wandering nature of the night. Taking inspiration from the European folk melodies and libretto that I mentioned earlier, I included some flourishes played on the saxophone and high piano that add some sparkle and playfulness. Following this, the upright bass plays an inversion of the main melody in its high range, which I think is a beautiful, delicate, and earthy sound that really works well here. So far, so good. I think this composition is working well, but if we look back at our rules, we still have to accommodate for rule number 5 here. We need a battle variation. One of the most simple ways of raising the intensity of a track for battle is to add more rhythm, and in this case, that could mean percussion instruments. I created an additional layer of percussion instruments on top of the already existing drum pattern, featuring a lot of sparkly instruments like the kabasa, shakers, and triangle. And that's it for my track in Bloom. Overall, it takes a more rhythmic approach to describing Greenpath's ambience, and I think it works. With Greenpath taken care of, let's head back to the Forgotten Crossroads and tackle the score for this spot. The Forgotten Crossroads is the first system of caves the player discovers after descending beneath the surface in Hallownest. The Wanderer's Journal describes the Forgotten Crossroads as consisting of many caverns and roads. Fossilized remains of bugs cover the surfaces of the caverns, with pale ferns growing through cracks in the ground. You come back here several times over the course of your playthrough, so it kind of functions as a hub area. The vibe here is very desolate and plain, and it's clear that something has happened here to cause this place to be in such a state of disarray. The original underscore for this location, titled Crossroads in the Hollow Knight OST, fits this location wonderfully. It's an ambient piece in E minor that uses a lot of string pads that rise and fall in intensity over time. There is an underlying rhythmic pulse, but it's really not that obvious in the music itself. There's a huge amount of reverb in this track, and it reminds me of what the knight might hear in their surroundings, as sounds echo throughout this seemingly endless tunnel network that comprises the Forgotten Crossroads. Since this is sort of a hub area, I wanted to make sure to keep this music sounding ambiguous, so you wouldn't get annoyed hearing it over and over again when you return. In part of my efforts to showcase the potential of jazz as a genre of music suitable for underscore, one thing I like to consider is how many different sounds you can draw out from the piano, upright bass, and drums. Usually in an ensemble like this, the piano takes the lead. I thought it would be interesting to turn this structure on its head and instead give the upright bass the melody. In its high register, the upright bass has a very warm and woody singing tone to it. Along with the bass melody, I also incorporated a drum set part performed using timpani mallets, which is a really unique sound. The mallets allow for really washy cymbal hits, which do a wonderful job of filling up all the space in this tune, and using the mallets to play rolls on the toms almost sounded like distant rumbling several rooms away. That just leaves the piano, which I gave more of a supporting, spice is needed kind of role. Instead of playing the piano normally using the hammers triggered by pressing down on the keys, I instead used techniques that involve directly touching the strings on the instrument. The sound of scraped piano strings is used pretty often in horror movie scores as a sound effect, so I thought it fit here in this creepy location pretty well. For those of you who have played Hollow Knight, you might be thinking of a certain something that happens in the Forgotten Crossroads later on in the game. In the interest of not spoiling things, I won't be doing music for that specific incident, and plus I think a different track is used for that in the OST, so we don't have to account for that as far as rule number 5 goes. However, the original track for the Forgotten Crossroads does include a battle mix, so let's include that too. Again, one of the simplest ways to add some action-y sounding elements of combat to a score is by adding some rhythm, just like we did with In Bloom. But the appropriate choices of percussion for the Forgotten Crossroads are pretty different. The first instrument I went for was the djembe, which is a traditional African percussion instrument known for deep, bassy tones. I kept this percussion part simple and played a constant stream of notes, with strong emphasis on the notes on the beat, which changed the piece from being a wistful ambient ballad into something more like a death march. I was imagining the bugs that you come across in the Forgotten Crossroads marching to the rhythm of the drum as they prepare to attack. Along with the djembe, I added a similar constant rhythmic pattern, but played on a muted piano string. By pressing on the end of a string on the piano with your finger, you can get a super cool metallic plucky sound, like a muted guitar. One cool thing you can do with this technique is to move your muting finger up and down the string as you play. As you do this, you're slightly changing the overtone structure of the sound. So even though the rhythm of the sound is constant, the character of the sound is always changing ever so slightly, which helps prevent the sound from getting too stale too quickly. That's all for my piece Lonely Nomad. This one turned out super cool. It's not a combination of sounds you hear super often, but I think it does a really good job here of being a unique piece of underscore. With two relatively calm and ambient themes out of the way, it's time to turn our attention towards something a bit more intense. One of the scariest, most challenging, and intimidating parts of this whole game. Sha! Adinu! Adidas! Hornet. The bane of many first-time players. Man, Carlos, if you think Hornet is bad, just wait until you get to Deep Nest. I remember coming across her in my first playthrough and dying over and over. Eventually I got good and won, but not before her battle theme managed to worm its way into my ear. Hornet first appears to the player a few times in Greenpath, where she seems to be observing the player up until the point where you confront her in her battle arena. Her fight features her dashing around at high speeds and using her thread and needle to attack the player in various ways. Her design is super cool, and her battle theme complements it nicely. Larkin's original composition primarily uses string instruments and blends in with the rest of the soundtrack nicely, while also working as a battle theme. The original track is centered in A minor and uses a lot of back and forth between 3/4 and 6/8 time. It feels kind of like a stately dance that's also really aggressive and intense, like you're dancing but also trying to strangle your partner at the same time. I have never tried that, don't take my word for it. I knew that this track would require a different approach than the ones before. This is a battle theme, so it's gotta stand out, but also still fit the vibe. I really struggled with finding a style for this tune, and scrapped a few melodies that I came up with early in the compositional process. Eventually, I decided to return to the Spotify playlist, and let the Spotify gods recommend me songs that might fit the vibe. After a few recommendations, I was blessed by the algorithm with a version of Spain from Chick Corea's Trilogy album. Chick Corea is probably my favorite jazz piano player of all time, and this version really hit me hard. It's this long live recording that starts with a classical guitar solo and eventually goes into a flute solo, and man, something about that just really hit me. I took another look at Hornet's character design and was like, you know, I bet Hornet could be a flamenco dancer. I mean, she's got a nice dress, jumps around, charges at you with needles, screams nonsensical words. That's exactly what a flamenco dancer does, right? Well, maybe not exactly, but it was good enough for me. So, flamenco jazz it was. I'm not really well versed in the tradition of flamenco music, but I know it's a kind of dance. And if dance music doesn't make you want to dance, it's not doing its job. I approached the composition rhythmically first, trying to come up with a drum groove that would work well for this kind of thing. After experimenting a bit, I realized that the drums just sounded way too heavy for a theme like this. I needed something more airborne and light that was more agile and took up less space than a drum kit. And there's absolutely nothing more airborne and agile than the cajon. Yep, I bought a cajon for this song. I actually had no idea that the cajon was historically used for flamenco music, but I guess I had probably heard it before somewhere. Anyway, after some experimentation and some very sore palms, I came up with a framework for the tune and started working on the melody. I tried a few different iterations of the melody until I got one that felt nice and light to fit in with the dance. Usually when I'm experimenting with melody writing, I do this at the piano and record voice memos on my iPad, and sometimes my dog Looker comes over to the piano and tries to help me out. I'll just play you the voice memo. Aw, what a good boy. With Looker's help, I nailed down the melody for the A and B section. I originally thought about writing it for piano and violin, but realized that using violin would probably violate rule number 4, since it's a primary instrument used in the original composition, and I gave it to flute instead, which is agile enough to handle it. With that, I had just one more problem to solve. I needed to inject this composition with a solid dose of flamenco guitar magic. I play a little bit of guitar myself, but not nearly enough to sound legit in this style. So I called up a professional. I sent over a chart and some backing tracks to Matt Selleck, who is a professional flamenco guitarist. Look, he even has the fingernails! And he absolutely knocked it out of the park. With Matt's part finally in the mix, I'm happy to share Hornet's new flamenco jazz battle theme called Thread the Needle. You know, I think Hornet could be a good guitarist. She works with thread a lot, and could probably create some sort of mechanism with her needle to stretch that thread like a guitar string. Maybe it's a stretch, but I think there's something there. This one was the most challenging tune to compose out of all the tunes I wrote for this project, and I could definitely see myself doing it differently if I were to compose a tune again. Maybe something with a more somber sound would be more appropriate to gel with the rest of the game and the music I wrote, but at the very least, I think this tune gives her battle an interesting spin. We've come so far in our musical journey through Hallownest, and have seen some very different locations. The lush vegetation of Greenpath is in stark contrast to the emptiness of the forgotten Crossroads, and the humidity of the fungal wastes is gross in its own way. All these locations have required different kinds of music to suit their atmospheres, and it's been a really fun process to experiment and rewrite this music in a new light. But all along the way through these areas, there have been murmurings of a grand city that awaits us. We're soon set to come across the capital city of Hallownest, the City of Tears. And man, what a location this is! The City of Tears is filled with large towers, opulent buildings, and constant drops of water raining down from the cracked stone ceiling above. It's a beautiful location, but contrary to what you might expect of a capital city, when you arrive here, it's oddly empty. Much like the Forgotten Crossroads, the player once again has to ask themselves, what happened here? It's here that I think the music does a great job of telling the story of this place, and fills in some of these gaps for the player. The City of Tears theme is my favorite piece of music from the Hollow Knight soundtrack, and it's certainly very distinct from the other tracks. It primarily features a soft piano ostinato that continues throughout the track, and a lead line performed by a soprano vocalist. As far as I know, this is the only time that the human voice appears prominently throughout the soundtrack, and it really does a great job of highlighting the significance of the City of Tears. This track has a rather long loop, and it does a great job of slowly developing as the tune progresses. Instruments come and go, and the energy level of the tune ebbs and flows as it modulates through different keys. Of all the tracks in the OST, this one is by far the one I was most afraid of recomposing. It's my favorite track from the soundtrack, which certainly makes it difficult, but this track is also an extremely significant part of the game's story, so it really needs to stand out. To help this track do that, I decided to use this opportunity to make the first really clear statement of a motif that I've been alluding to throughout the previous songs I've shared. I love soundtracks that use motifs throughout the story's progression to convey meaning, so I thought I'd take this approach with my tracks for this project. It's hard to pinpoint an exact formula for what makes a good motif, but in general, they tend to be melodic fragments that are relatively short, simple, easy to memorize, and are played repeatedly. I've been using this melodic fragment throughout some previous tracks. This melody does have some small resemblances to the main Hollow Knight theme, I guess you could say, but I don't think it's really similar enough to merit any significance. Without getting into all the music theory behind this, there are only so many unique melodies, and certain types of melodies are just very idiomatic for certain moods. I decided to present the melody in full with the flugelhorn on this track. I've certainly sung my praises about the flugelhorn before, but I think its unique qualities really work well here. I wanted this melody to sound like a regal fanfare, since this is a capital city after all, but didn't want it to sound as bright and forward of a fanfare as a trumpet might play. The flugelhorn's delicate sound evokes the feeling of a fanfare coming from a forgotten era to me, like the previous inhabitants of the City of Tears are trying to share their story and share their troubles that they endured. I accompany the flugelhorn melody with delicate piano, guitar, bass, and a drum set played with brushes. This delicate ensemble preserves that unique feeling of wondering, what happened here? The piece builds over time, with the lead melody and the flugelhorn becoming more pronounced as the backing instruments take on a more aggressive role. After a long section of expansion and development, the song hits a peak and then contracts down to a quiet, small-sounding section, with the main melody restated, but this time in a major key. I viewed this section as a small glimmer of hope. While the main melody in the City of Tears as a whole, for the most part, is kind of sad and longing, I thought this major key section would be a nice contrast, like a little bit of hopeful light coming through one of the many rainy windows in the City of Tears. Since this is a looping composition, the hope that's presented at the end of the loop with this major section ultimately fades away and is met with the sadness present from the beginning of the loop. So the emotional arc persists even as the song loops. I'm very happy to share my last composition for this challenge with you, titled Splashes of Sorrow. Wow, so I guess that's it. Writing these 4 pieces to rescore Hollow Knight's soundtrack was really challenging to do, but also so much fun. I hope this video showed you some of the versatility that jazz music can have, and that the stereotypes we have about it aren't necessarily always true, and it can be more useful in many situations. If you've got any other games you might want to see me try this challenge with, then leave a comment below. I'm not sure I'm going to be doing this regularly, but in the event that I do, I would love to have some suggestions from you guys. As a reminder, you can check out the inspiration playlist for this score on Spotify, and you can also listen to the music I created for this challenge on my Bandcamp page or on my Spotify and other music distribution platforms. This has been Insane in the Rain Music. Thank you so much for watching this, and I will see you in the next video.